Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear colleagues, and welcome to our webinar. We are really thrilled to have you with us today on the Human Rights Day for commemoration of this special day and for discussing with us engagement of faith leaders and faith communities in addressing HIV and discrimination. I would like to quickly remind us about the purpose of the meeting, but before that, a couple of organizational announcements. For colleagues who have not yet noticed, we do provide interpretation into French, so the meeting will be run in English and French. And another organizational request is that colleagues who do not speak are kindly requested to mute their microphones through the duration of the event. So the purpose of this meeting, we are celebrating today and commemorating today Human Rights Day, and we would like to focus our today's webinar on the engagement of faith partners into the response and specifically in addressing stigma and discrimination related to the HIV and other epidemics. The framework for dialogue, which is the platform, will showcase a practical and inspirational example of stigma and discrimination reduction interventions by faith groups in collaboration with networks of people living with HIV, in collaboration with interfaith networks of religious leaders living with or affected by HIV, both represented here by GNP Plus and Inrela Plus, governments and other key players, and the way they contribute to fostering more resilience and just societies. This webinar is co-organized by many partners, but I would like to mention here especially the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance, who is in this exercise with us, GNP Plus, Inrela Plus, from the very beginning of this path. And now, let me turn the floor to Sandy Turman, Chief Strategy Officer of the Office of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and Health Diplomacy, who is one of the main drivers behind the UNAIDS PEPFAR Faith Initiative, and definitely one of the top leaders of the global dialogue and faith engagement into the HIV response. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Excuse me, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I wanted to start by thanking Jacek and Francesca and the team at UNAIDS for putting this webinar together to mark Human Rights Day and the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which really proclaims the dignity of every human life and calls us all to not leave anyone behind in the work that we all do together. And I think that's particularly important in the context of the work that we do as faith-based communities and in dealing with stigma and discrimination of all types. So I want to just mention as we start our program today, the incredible role that faith-based communities have played in the response to HIV since the very, very beginning of the response in the early 1980s. And faith-based communities have always been an incredibly important partner to all of us working in HIV and AIDS for all these years in both the care and treatment of people living with HIV and engaging with communities as trusted partners to get people to get tested and to get and it goes on today with our partners who are leading in areas like the faith-based partners have been a really important partner to all of us in working on HIV historically. So we want to look a little bit closer at areas of stigma and discrimination today to see how we can work more effectively together with our faith-based partners in addressing stigma and discrimination. We're going to have a really wonderful panel To start, the panelists are going to speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers at the end of their presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker today is Ibrahim Salama, who's the Chief of Human Rights Treaties Branch at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So Ibrahim, would you join us now? And we look forward to your remarks.
To thank UNAIDS and its partners in organizing this very timely discussion on the role of faith actors in combating stigma in the area of HIV infected people. And it's absolutely important to reflect on the lessons learned so far, because many UN actors are starting to realize the increased importance of the role of faith actors in different areas. And dialogues are very important. And I'm glad that in the case of UNAIDS, there is specific frameworks for these dialogues, and that they are conducting on the country level rather than the international and the rather abstract level of this issue. From outside, in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we are very pleased to be associated to this experience to share with you two angles to the same issue that you are dealing with. The first one is the rights-based approach, and the second is the faith-based approach. The rights-based approach to combating stigma for HIV people is very important. And I have shared with our colleagues in UNAIDS my talking points, so I'm not going to use them, but of course, whatever we can produce later. I listed examples of the different jurisprudence and the different views of treaty bodies, which are expert bodies monitoring state compliance, particularly the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as early as the 17th of November of this year, have issued a general comment, for example, on the human rights dimension of the accessibility to vaccine for the COVID-19. And earlier, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the guardian of the right to health, was also able to formulate very specific recommendations to states in the area of HIV and other related right to health issues. And one of the important tools that I want to underline for you and all our partners in the faith-based community is that we have a human rights index, which is a web-based tool that allow us to retrieve and find thematically. For example, if we take the AIDS-related recommendations, whether in general comments or in country-specific recommendations, one can extract all of this immediately. And that's how I used to produce the input that I shared with the organizers, who can eventually, in their own choices, see what can be shared with participants if this is useful. But the most useful thing to consider sharing is how to make a human rights tool friendly user, including for faith actors. And this takes me from the rights-based approach to the faith-based approach to this matter. Treaty bodies have produced their own toolkit of jurisprudence on the health and other human rights related consequences of COVID-19. It's a tool that combines all the jurisprudence in this respect, and I'm sure if both UNAIDS and our partners from the religious organizations can have a faith-based reading of these findings. But secondly, a second toolkit is the Faithful Rights Toolkit, which was issued since a year already by a combination of religious leaders and human rights actors working in the field of faith and rights, along with the relevant special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council and the relevant treaty bodies. all in their individual capacity, articulated 18 commitments on faithful rights. And this includes the right to health and includes the issue of stigmatization, not only in the case of HIV, but any analogous situation. And this toolkit on faithful rights is what we suggest could probably be tested to see its relevance for your own dialogues framework in the field. We will be very happy if you find it useful to try to pilot this use, because the main difference in this toolkit is that we have nothing to lecture to faith actors. We have a lot to learn from them. This is a simple fact and not false modesty. That's the lesson I personally learned from many peer-to-peer learning exercises. And that's why this toolkit, far from providing answers to all questions, as some may think that is the role of the UN. It's not the role of the UN. Nobody have monopolizes the truth. The UN's strength is as a melting pot for different experiences, and it's time to open up. And I think if COVID-19 have taught us only one lesson, this should be that we have to listen, rethink, reconsider, come closer, and try something new. So I leave it here, and I would be happy to engage in the discussion later on if there are any clarifications or suggestions. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That was really wonderful. I'm interested to talk and ask some more questions at the end about the Faithful Rights Toolkit. That sounds fascinating. And our next speaker is Luisa Cabal, who's a special advisor for human rights and gender at UNAIDS, to talk a little bit about stigma and discrimination and their impact on HIV and COVID-19. Luisa, are you ready to join us?
Yes. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are, colleagues, and happy International Human Rights Day. We have been at UNAIDS all day in panels, discussions, and issuing statements to commemorate this day and the centrality of placing human rights at the center of the HIV response. Next slide, please. I'll just very briefly make some reflections on really taking stock of all the progress that we have been making in the AIDS response in terms of reducing new HIV infections and reducing the numbers of AIDS-related deaths. But next slide. As we're also embarking in our new strategy at UNAIDS, it becomes even clearer that we need to tackle, there's a critical imperative to tackle gender inequality and discrimination. Let us just remember that adolescent girls and young women constitute 59% of all new infections in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. But equally critical, and again, we're in a panel led by our executive director, Winnie Byanyima, who was reminding us about the role that unfortunately punitive approaches and punitive laws continue to play in fueling the pandemic and in exacerbating marginalization and vulnerability among many groups, including key populations. Next slide, please. As you all know, UNAIDS also keeps track of, are we making progress or not enough around reducing stigma and discrimination? And our latest reports reveal that the most recent data basically show that while discriminatory attitudes towards people with HIV are declining in some regions, unfortunately, they're also rebounding in others. We also hear continued allegations of discrimination and stigma in health facilities. And here, again, this is a critical obstacle, and this is an area where the faith community can continue to play a critical role. Just to give you an idea of the impacts of these punitive approaches that we know in sub-Saharan Africa, knowledge of HIV status among gay and other men who have sex with men living with HIV is 3 times higher in countries with least severe anti-LGBT legislation. This means that the more severe the punitive approaches are in a given context, knowledge of HIV testing, fear of testing, fear of accessing health facilities increases. And so it becomes more and more data that we have available points to the negative impacts of discriminatory laws. Next slide. But we also know what works. And we just released, working as part of a global partnership I'll be talking about, the latest evidence of what we know works to address stigma and discrimination. We know that there are laws that are obstacles. We know that self-stigma harms people. We also know that there are proven interventions to reduce stigma and to promote inclusion in health facilities, but also in other contexts, such as in the education sector, in law enforcement, in the communities themselves. We hope that this tool becomes a tool in your toolkit to advance the strategies that we know work. Next slide, please. And very tied to our prior panelist that reminded us of some of the legal obligations and the human rights standards that human rights bodies have been issuing. We also have a global partnership that arose from communities coming together and pushing UNAIDS and other UN partners for greater accountability on the ground, and trying to send the message that we have the human rights obligations. We also have political commitments, such as the 2016 political declaration. But we created this global partnership with UN partners, with UNDP, with UN Women, with the global network of people living with HIV, precisely because we need to go to each country, build alliances, such as alliances with faith-based organizations, around how we catalyze more programmatic investments to reduce stigma and discrimination. So far, 18 countries have joined this partnership. We can share those countries because it becomes critical that you join us in pushing this agenda at national level. I wanted to end with a couple of reflections, a few final slides of some of the work that we have been doing. Next slide. Applying lessons from HIV and human rights to the COVID-19 response. And we know that when there is fear and when there is misinformation, discrimination and stigma can be fueled. We are still living with the consequences of fear around HIV, reflected, for example, in travel restrictions. In numerous countries around the world continue to deport, to block entrance to people living with HIV. And next slide. One of our key areas of work this year has been actually showcasing, putting a spotlight on the impacts of these punitive approaches on COVID-19 and in people affected by COVID-19, and how it has further marginalized groups if we're not vigilant about how these discriminatory approaches and punitive approaches to addressing this new pandemic are not addressed. So we also hope that you can read this report, Rights in a Pandemic, where there are 3 areas of recommendation based on our learnings in HIV and human rights that we hope we should also integrate in the toolkit that we are using to engage our communities, including all of your communities. So I'll leave it there and I'll turn it back to you, Sandy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luisa. I really appreciate it. That was an excellent presentation. We now are going to, let's see where we are here. We have Kate. So Kate, are you with us? Kate Thompson is the head of the Community Rights and Gender Department at the Global Fund. And Kate, are you ready?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me, Sandy?
Yes, I can. There you are.
Fantastic. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues and friends. It's really a pleasure to be here and to join you all on this this Human Rights Day in a year when I think we've seen more than ever the need for strong and collaborative efforts to protect human rights and to address stigma and discrimination. And thanks in particular to the organizers, especially to Jacek and to Francesca. Since the early days of the epidemic, faith-based organizations have played and continue to play a really important role in the response to the HIV epidemic and to the concurrent epidemic that we have seen, the epidemic of stigma and discrimination. And they've done this through their strong presence in and links with communities on the ground, as well as those broad networks of health facilities. Many partners on this call, I know many of you have been working together over many decades now to ensure that faith-based and rights-based approaches align for effective evidence-informed interventions that really work to reducing stigma and discrimination and other human rights-related barriers. And I remember when I was diagnosed with HIV way back in the mid-1980s, that faith-based organizations were some of the most strong advocates against stigma and discrimination, and some of the best providers of safer and supportive services for those of us living with HIV. Within the context of the Global Fund, we've been doing baseline assessments in 20 countries through what we call our Breaking Down Barriers initiative, which have really reinforced the evidence and the understanding that religious leaders and faith initiatives have a critical role to play in reducing the misconceptions that fuel stigma and discrimination, and that they're really key partners in promoting respectful and compassionate responses. However, our findings have also shown that there are still too many instances when religious and traditional leaders are not properly capacitated to act as the progressive leaders of change that they can and they should be. So sadly, programs to engage faith-based organizations and interventions to address stigma and discrimination through that engagement of religious leaders so often remain sporadic and uncoordinated and limited in scale in many countries. So what we're really trying to do through our processes is to ensure that there's much more support and coordinated approaches. There have been many notable efforts to engage religious and cultural leaders on issues affecting key and vulnerable populations and to more systematically enlist their support to address stigma and discrimination. And I know that many of you will be much more familiar with these than me. You've been working on those over many years, but I'll share a couple of recent examples. Firstly, the joint engagement of religious leaders and village health teams in Uganda, which is something that we've seen within the context of Global Fund programs. And secondly, the advocacy carried out by INERELA, which I think probably everyone here knows is the international network of religious leaders living with or affected by HIV. And their work with religious leaders in Kenya to promote access to HIV and TB services, particularly for HIV key populations, as well as women and children. Multi-stakeholder meetings that we've organized at the Global Fund under our Breaking Down Barriers initiative to review the findings of these baseline assessments that I spoke about and to initiate participatory national strategic processes for the development of plans for comprehensive human rights responses to human rights related barriers have been another really important platform for the Global Fund's engagement with faith-based organizations. And our last multi-stakeholder meeting happened in Kenya just last week. And it benefited hugely from the very active participation of INERELA, for which we were really grateful. And earlier today, the Botswana Plan for a Comprehensive Response is another example of the strong recognition of the role of traditional and religious leaders in stigma and discrimination reduction. It includes within it interventions that are aimed at supporting collaboration between district health management teams, organizations of people with disabilities and other civil society organizations, and traditional and religious leaders for increased partnerships and community buy-in to address not only social and cultural, but also religious drivers of stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV, TB, and key and vulnerable populations. Based on these efforts, we're seeing that interventions to reduce stigma and discrimination and other human rights related barriers included in Global Fund grants for the current funding cycle are acknowledging the need for those comprehensive interventions across multiple settings with full involvement of all partners, including communities and faith-based organizations. And our ongoing assessments, midterm assessments in the 20 countries are pointing to strongly to the importance of partnerships and coordinated efforts for comprehensive responses. So the global response to HIV really changed the path of global health, inspiring, I'd say, unprecedented global solidarity and collective action of all communities in their diversity, governments, donors and partners. And the current COVID-19 crisis, which Louisa spoke to, and the global response, I think represents a real opportunity to put front and center the recognition of rights-related and health-related rights in order to ensure equitable, non-discriminatory access for everybody. In our responses to HIV, TB, malaria, and COVID-19, we really need to ensure that we leave no one behind, and that we commit to protecting everybody, everywhere, from the deadliest of infections. And within that, we must make stigma and discrimination history and strengthen the community systems and responses that are critical to ending all epidemics. We must address the human rights violations wherever they occur, knowing from experience that protecting the most vulnerable protects everyone. And communities of faith are central and essential and influential partners in promoting human rights and ending stigma and discrimination. I want to end by acknowledging the enormous amount of work and incredible dedication that colleagues on this call and your communities of faith have demonstrated in this important agenda. The Global Fund is committed to continuing to work with and strengthen our collaboration with communities of faith to continue to protect human rights and to address stigma and discrimination. And I'd really like to thank you all so much for this opportunity to be here with you today. It's a real honor. Thanks. Back to you, Sonia.
Thanks so much, Kate. I really appreciate that. It's a great presentation. And now we have joining us Madam Mujinga Biman Shah from the Ministry of Justice in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Madam, are you with us?
Vous savez, comme vous savez, la RDC, c'est un pays post-conflit et nous avons à gérer beaucoup de problèmes, surtout sur le plan stigmatisation et discrimination à l'égard des personnes vivant avec VIH et personnes vulnérables et par rapport aux groupes, aux populations clés. Est-ce qu'on peut dire, s'il vous plaît? Vous pouvez passer? Voilà. Pour parler de la stigmatisation et la discrimination au niveau de la RDC, il fallait d'abord faire le constat. Parce qu'on ne pouvait pas parler de ce phénomène sans pour autant avoir les évidences. C'est comme ça qu'en 2012, il y a eu ce que nous avons appelé l'index des stigmas. Il y a eu des enquêtes qui ont été menées dans plusieurs catégories, auprès de plusieurs catégories de personnes. Et cette enquête de stigma a révélé certains pourcentages de stigmatisation et de discrimination à l'égard de certaines personnes dans plusieurs milieux. Comme ça, par exemple, en milieu sanitaire, là, j'avais oublié de mentionner, il y a 32%, il s'est révélé qu'en milieu sanitaire, il y a 32,8% de stigmatisation et de discrimination à l'égard des personnes vivant avec VIH. Et ces stigmatisations et discriminations proviennent de personnel qui travaille dans les hôpitaux, notamment les médecins et les infirmiers. En milieu religieux, il a été découvert qu'il y a 82% de stigmatisation et de discrimination. Parce que dans les milieux religieux, la plupart des cas, on considère les personnes qui sont positifs comme ayant contacté le VIH à la suite des relations sexuelles coupables, notamment quand ils ont trompé leur femme et leur mari. Nous avons maintenant en activité sociale, nous avons 25% de stigmatisation et de discrimination en matière sociale. En milieu familial, il y a 20,74% des personnes qui sont souvent exclues dans les milieux familiaux quand il y a des activités, quand il y a des cérémonies, au motif qu'ils sont des personnes qui peuvent contaminer. Nous avons en matière du travail, au service de l'éducation et de la santé, nous avons 51,1%. Ça, ce sont des pourcentages qui se sont dégagés de l'étude STIGMA de 2012. On peut aller? On peut passer, s'il vous plaît? Alors, en 2019, pour savoir s'il y a eu des avancées ou pas, il y a eu une autre enquête qui a été faite. Cette enquête-là, STIGMA, a révélé qu'il y avait une diminution de 5% sur le taux par rapport à 2012. C'est une enquête qui a été menée par le PNMLS, discrimination et la stigma. Il n'y a eu que 5% seulement de diminution par rapport à 2012. Dia, on peut aller? Alors, vous voyez, 5%, ce n'est pas fameux, alors que nous voulons atteindre 100% de non-stigmatisation et de discrimination. Alors, comment on a pu pouvoir obtenir même les 5% là? Parce que quand nous avions eu à faire cette enquête STIGMA, nous nous sommes dit il faut après cela organiser des activités. Nous avons d'abord mis sur place le plan stratégie des axes clairs, notamment les axes concernant l'environnement juridique favorable par rapport aux personnes vivant avec VIH et personnes affectées. Et puis, il y a eu une loi qui a été élaborée en 2008. Cette loi porte protection des droits des personnes vivant avec VIH et personnes affectées. Et une des dispositions de cette loi a prévu la stigmatisation et la discrimination comme une infraction. Donc, chaque fois que quelqu'un se retrouve discriminé ou stigmatisé par rapport à sa séropositivité, cette personne peut saisir les cours et tribunaux parce que c'était une infraction. C'est devenu déjà une infraction. Nous ne sommes pas en tenue à ça seulement. Nous avons estimé que pour que ces infractions puissent être réellement appliquées, pour que la loi soit réellement appliquée, il fallait s'adresser aussi aux acteurs judiciaires. C'est comme ça qu'avec le secteur justice, nous avons pu organiser des formations, des séances de formation, de sensibilisation des magistrats, des avocats, des prestataires de soins, des personnels pénitentiaires, des parlementaires et les leaders religieux. Aujourd'hui, nous avons formé pratiquement 2300 magistrats qui sont à même de comprendre les questions de stigmatisation et de discrimination, et même 700 avocats qui peuvent accompagner ces victimes au niveau des cours et tribunaux pour pouvoir les aider à pouvoir porter plainte et à obtenir réparation par rapport aux préjudices qu'ils commettent, qu'ils ont subis plutôt. Et nous avons pu aussi associer les communautaires, Parce que vous savez, quand vous regardez dans le dia que nous avons projeté, il y a la communauté, dans la communauté, les sociales, il y a un grand pourcentage de stigmatisation et de discrimination. Donc, il fallait aussi rassembler les communautaires, les ONG des droits de l'homme pour les sensibiliser, les former aussi sur ce qui concerne les stigmatisations, leur faire comprendre que la stigmatisation et la discrimination étaient devenues des infractions punissables dans RDC. Il a fallu aussi que la RDC puisse souscrire pour le partenariat mondial sur l'élimination de la discrimination dans les domaines de justice communautaire et sanitaire. Nous avons aussi les appuis, parce que tout ce que nous disons là, sans appui technique, sans appui financier, nous ne pouvons pas obtenir ces pourcentages-là et tous ces résultats. Donc, il y a PNUD, il y a le Fonds mondial, il y a l'ONU-SIDA qui nous ont toujours accompagnés, y compris le PNMLS qui nous ont toujours accompagnés dans cette lutte-là. Dia, on peut passer. OK? Alors, compte tenu de tous ces efforts que nous avons faits, c'est vrai, nous fournissons des efforts, mais nous constatons qu'il y a toujours la persistance de la stigmatisation et la discrimination à l'égard des personnes vivant avec VIH. Et ces phénomènes se retrouvent surtout dans les milieux sanitaires, parce que c'est là où la première personne est consultée, là où on connaît son statut sérologique, et les premiers qui divulguent sont les personnes qui les prennent en charge. Et à ce moment-là, ça devient difficile de lutter contre la stigmatisation. Il y a aussi les milieux religieux, parce que dans les milieux religieux, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, il est difficile de convaincre les acteurs, les leaders religieux. Il est difficile de leur faire passer les messages pour dire qu'il faut, eux qui prennent l'amour du prochain, devaient aussi aimer toutes ces personnes-là qui sont affectées par le VIH et essayer de les encadrer pour éviter la stigmatisation et la discrimination. Il en est de même dans les milieux professionnels où la stigmatisation persiste. Il suffit qu'on apprenne qu'un travailleur est séropositif pour qu'on commence à lui créer des problèmes. Et en fin de compte, il y aura un licenciement abusif. Nous ne pouvons pas oublier le domaine éducatif dans les écoles. Dans les écoles, les enfants sont souvent, il y a des enfants qui fuient l'école parce que tout simplement, leur père a eu à déclarer, à faire un témoignage à visage découvert qu'il était séropositif et le lendemain, l'enfant était hué, tout le monde parlait du mal de lui et l'enfant était mal à l'aise. Des fois, il fuit même l'école. Alors, pour ce qui concerne toutes ces affaires-là de stigmatisation et de discrimination, au niveau de la RDC, nous nous sommes organisés en ce que nous appelons les cliniques juridiques. Nous avons une clinique juridique au sein du secteur de la justice qui récupère tous ces cas des personnes vivant avec VIH qui sont victimes de stigmatisation et de discrimination. Alors, quand les cliniques reçoivent toutes ces personnes, comme nous avons déjà formé des magistrats, nous avons déjà formé des avocats, les cliniques réfèrent ces personnes auprès de nous. Moi, en tant que point focal droit et VIH, j'ai des tribunaux pour voir que la justice soit réellement bien dite. Notons en passant ici qu'au niveau des cours et tribunaux, il y a eu ce que nous appelons les cellules. On a créé des cellules de lutte contre les violences sexuelles. Et au niveau de ces cellules de lutte contre les violences sexuelles, nous avons formé tous ces magistrats-là par rapport aux notions des droits et VIH. Alors, quand il y a des cas de stigmatisation et de discrimination, nous envoyons ces cas-là. Quand les cliniques me les envoient, moi, j'envoie ces cas-là au niveau des cours et tribunaux. Et ce sont ces magistrats qui sont dans les cellules de lutte contre les violences sexuelles que nous avons formés qui s'occupent de recevoir ces cas-là. Et je crois que jusque-là, ça marche quand même. On peut passer. Maintenant, ici, c'est un tableau qui n'est pas très ventilé, mais ce que nous pouvons vous donner comme cas, c'est qu'en 2018, nous avons eu 102 cas de stigmatisation et de discrimination qui sont passés par les cliniques juridiques et qui sont passés par nous en tant que point focal droit et VIH, et nous les avons déférés devant les cours et tribunaux. Nous sommes en train de les suivre. Nous avons même des cas des jugements qui ont été rendus. Vous m'excuserez parce qu'on n'a pas eu le temps de pouvoir récupérer tous ces cas-là. En 2019, nous avons eu 159 cas au total et en 2020, nous avons 94. Et ces cas-là concernent quelle situation? Nous avons les cas de spoliation. Spoliation surtout en matière foncière. Spoliation en matière foncière quand il y a des conflits au niveau de la famille, surtout quand le père est décédé en matière de succession. Souvent, on a tendance à spolier les terres des héritiers. Nous avons la discrimination et la stigmatisation. Ça, ce sont des cas qui sont vécus à la cité. Par exemple, des femmes des vendeuses qui vendent leurs marchandises, quand la voisine constate qu'elle vend plus, elle va créer des problèmes. Si elle apprend que la personne est séropositive, elle va divulguer ce cas-là et les clients vont lâcher et vont partir. Et ces cas-là aussi sont déférés devant la justice. Courante au niveau des sociétés, des entreprises. Et c'est ce qui fait que maintenant, les gens qui sont, les travailleurs qui sont séropositifs ont tendance à se cacher. Parce qu'une fois qu'ils sont découverts, le patron, le patron lui-même, l'employeur, commence à leur créer des misères et en fin de compte, on crée un faux motif pour les mettre à la porte. Ces cas-là, nous les suivons aussi au niveau des cours et tribunaux. Il y a aussi des cas de chantage. Quelqu'un qui sait très bien que l'autre est séropositif. Il va les mettre dans une position où il va commencer à lui faire des chantages pour obtenir de lui ce qu'il veut, parce que s'il refuse de lui donner, il va divulguer son état sérologique. Nous avons des cas de violence physique, des coups et blessures. Ça, c'est surtout dans les cas des ménages. Au point que la situation actuelle, nous avons eu à voir certaines femmes qui ont dit carrément qu'elles étaient séropositives. Leur séropositivité avait été découverte lors de la consultation prénatale, mais n'ont jamais dit à leur mari. Et là aussi, ce sont les conséquences de la stigmatisation et la discrimination. Nous avons les cas de privation des droits successoraux, comme je venais de le dire, en cas d'héritage. On préfère exclure la personne qui est séropositif dans la succession au motif que c'est quelqu'un qui ne va pas faire longtemps sur la vie, sur la terre, ça ne servait à rien de lui donner. Nous avons les cas de rejet et abandon des familles. Beaucoup d'hommes qui ont découvert que leurs épouses étaient séropositifs les ont carrément abandonnés en jetant même les enfants dehors. Ce sont des cas aussi qui se retrouvent devant les cours et tribunaux. Nous avons les cas de divulgation des statuts sérologiques. Ça, c'est surtout dans les milieux religieux et dans les milieux sanitaires. Les leaders religieux ont souvent tendance à pouvoir parler aux autres, aux personnes étrangères, des cas des personnes séropositives qui sont venues se confier à eux dans le cadre de la prière. Alors, au lieu de prier directement, ils prennent un groupe de personnes et ces groupes de personnes sont mis au courant du statut sérologique au motif qu'ils doivent prier. Mais entre-temps, quand ils rentrent à la cité, ils en parlent à tout le monde. Vous pouvez passer, s'il vous plaît. Allez-y. Alors maintenant, ce qui doit changer, c'est quoi? Nous constatons qu'il y a la persistance de la stigmatisation et la discrimination envers les personnes vivant avec VIH, malgré les interventions, les efforts que nous faisons. Mais l'impact sur le terrain ne suit pas. D'où il faut changer les stratégies. si nous voulons d'ici 2023 atteindre 100% pour réduire la stigmatisation et la discrimination. Donc, nous devons déployer des efforts. Les efforts déployés depuis 2012 jusqu'à 2019 nous ont donné une réduction, mais très, très minime, surtout par rapport aux milieux religieux. Je répète, les milieux religieux nous posent beaucoup de problèmes. C'est pourquoi il y a aussi les milieux éducatifs professionnels, comme nous l'avons dit. Alors, il y a la persistance des attitudes discriminatoires des hommes à l'égard des femmes, les 20%, 26% des 15 à 45 ans envers les personnes vivant avec VIH. Vous pouvez passer, s'il vous plaît. S'il vous plaît, allez-y. Maintenant, quels sont les facteurs favorisants? Surtout dans les milieux religieux, il y a persistance à cause des fausses croyances. Il y a persistance à cause des fausses croyances qui font que dans les milieux religieux, on croit que la personne qui est séropositif n'est pas quelqu'un qui est digne de confiance, c'est quelqu'un qu'on doit exclure de la communauté, c'est quelqu'un qui a eu qui a attrapé la maladie à cause du péché, d'où tout le monde se méfie de cette personne-là. Et pourtant, il y a des dispositions légales dans notre pays qui sanctionnent, d'où il faut vraiment qu'il y ait une grande sensibilisation. Voilà, les décisions à venir, c'est qu'il faut sensibiliser surtout les communautaires. Et nous visons ici les milieux religieux, les leaders religieux, comme ils sont compris par plusieurs et qu'ils ont la possibilité de rassembler un grand nombre, les leaders religieux ont un rôle important à jouer. Et voilà qu'à cause du fait qu'ils sont écoutés par un grand nombre, dès qu'ils disent que telle personne est séropositive et dangereuse, c'est toute une église, des milliers de personnes qui se méfient. Voilà un peu pourquoi nous insistons sur les milieux religieux et les leaders religieux. On peut aller? Il faut mener des études visant à combattre la persistance des attitudes et développer aussi les interventions innovantes et adaptées selon les causes identifiées dans chaque milieu dans la communauté. Il faut changer des stratégies. Il faut impliquer et s'assurer du modèle de leadership communautaire pour combattre les attitudes discriminatoires dans la communauté. Il faut associer la communauté, expliquer à la communauté ce qu'il doit faire pour qu'elle puisse changer. Ici, il y a un problème sérieux de changement de comportement. Nous devons étudier, travailler sur la mentalité de la communauté pour qu'elle puisse s'impliquer dans cette lutte-là. Dans les milieux religieux, il faut changer aussi par rapport aux programmes de santé. Les programmes de santé doivent s'impliquer et nous estimons que la justice aussi. Mais pour la justice, nous disons que les actions qui pénalisent ne sont pas très à prendre en considération. Voilà pourquoi nous procédons aussi au niveau de la justice à sensibiliser par rapport à l'existence de la loi et au caractère discriminatoire, à tout ce qui est comme discrimination et stigmatisation, le mauvais côté de ces actes-là. Voilà, je crois que nous avons terminé. C'est ça le modeste exposé que nous avons à vous présenter pour aujourd'hui. Je vous remercie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation, and I look forward to us being able to have some questions now. I'm sure people have comments and questions. Look here in the chat. We've got about 15 minutes for discussion, and then we'll see if we can't find a little more time at the end as well. So let me see here. Okay, I'm looking for the questions. Hold on 2 seconds.
Answers.
There is George who would like to take the floor, Sandy.
Okay, great. That sounds good. Please take the floor.
Stuck. George, unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, George.
Yes. My name is George Shendu Pindua, speaking from Tanzania, representing Tanarera. So I would like to ask one question. What is the role of the church in fighting for discrimination for those people who are affected with HIV/AIDS?
Thank you, George. Would one of the panelists like to respond to George's question, please?
Yes, Sandy, in case there is nobody else, I would say that the role is fundamental, I think. And I was pleasantly surprised when we were discussing with religious leaders how do they relate religious teachings to a number of human rights that we pre-selected for the elaboration of faithful rights, that in some areas the faith traditions do really exceed the threshold of human rights as we know it in international positive law. The only missing thing is the adapted narrative that allows literacy about religion in the human rights community and about human rights in the religious community. That's why I find that health diplomacy needs spiritual diplomacy. And it would be unfair to religious actors and institutions to suppose that they can do the homework themselves. They need to do it together with human rights actors. And that was the essence of our very emerging experience with the Faithful Rights Toolkit. In many areas, when we adopt the peer-to-peer learning issues and adapt it and focus it on issues of stigmatization, we found that the international standards are rather minimal as compared to the duties of compassion and solidarity and direct rescue that many faith traditions held deep into their practices. So not only they have a lot to do, we have a lot to learn from them. Over to you, Sandy.
Ibrahim, that's fascinating. It makes me think that at some point in the near future that we ought to spend some time and see if we can't do a session just focusing on this thing. I love your, really love your idea of the fact that health diplomacy needs, you know, religious diplomacy and some, or interfaith diplomacy of some kind to be successful. I think we could all, and recognizing that we all have so much to learn from each other, and that the tenets of our human rights work are the same as most of our religious traditions. And so we'll talk offline about that. I think that would be fascinating. Thank you so much. I think that I don't think we have any other questions at the moment. So I want to give our presenters an opportunity to make a quick. Oh, Dominique. Okay, do we have another question, Francesca? Or no?
It seems Dominique. Dominique wants to speak.
Dominique, okay. Dominique, please take the floor.
Oui, merci. Je suis heureux d'apprendre beaucoup de choses à travers cette conférence, mais je voulais réagir par rapport à ce que a dit tout à l'heure la présentatrice par rapport aux confessions religieuses. J'ai écrit, il est difficile de faire comprendre la problématique de discrimination et de stigmatisation dans les milieux religieux. Je voudrais ici faire savoir que en RDC, en ce qui concerne le Conseil interconfessionnel de lutte contre le VIH, il y a eu beaucoup d'avancées, puisque en 2019, du 20 au 21 août 2019, nous avons organisé une table ronde entre les confessions, les chefs des confessions religieuses et les PVVIH. C'était avec l'appui de l'ONU-SIDA et l'accompagnement du PNMLS. Et à cette occasion-là, les chefs religieux ont pris un engagement solennel. Et j'ai même la déclaration d'engagement des confessions religieuses de la RDC pour lutter contre la stigmatisation. Et je prends juste, par rapport au temps, je prends juste ce qui était dit. Étant donné que ces communautés de foi ont permis de comprendre que face au VIH-Sida, la croyance en Dieu constitue un élément positif combattant la stigmatisation et la discrimination, qu'elle aide les personnes touchées par le virus à surmonter cette épreuve. Eu égard à la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme de 1948, soucieux de créer un environnement favorable à la lutte contre cette pandémie et de ne laisser personne pour compte dans la prise en charge tant médicale que psycho-spirituelle, prenons l'engagement de 1. Prôner l'amour véritable, combattre toute stigmatisation, discrimination des personnes infectées et affectées par le VIH et de contextualiser nos discours religieux. 2. Informer et former les leaders et les membres de nos communautés respectives sur les sujets liés au VIH-Sida. Et le dernier engagement, c'est de recommander aux leaders et aux membres de nos communautés de faire preuve de plus d'ouverture, de patience, de discernement par rapport aux problèmes de PVIH en vue de leur témoigner l'amour de Dieu qui aime, qui console et qui conduit l'homme à son plein épanouissement et à sa réalisation intégrale. Donc, la question ici, l'engagement a été pris. Maintenant, c'était la problématique de conduire, d'encadrer cet engagement des confessions religieuses. Voilà ce que je voulais dire à ce sujet.
There we go. There you go. Sorry. Thank you, Dominique. We really appreciate that input and are very interested in the work that the Interfaith Council has done and would love to see some of those documents. So we'll see if we can't get together with you and possibly make those available to those who would like to see them. Let me see. Do we have other comments or questions? I think our.
Yes, I would like to say something. My name is Very Reverend Dr. Evans Onyemara.
Evans, yes.
I am the General Secretary of the Christian Council of Nigeria. And we work with the World Council of Churches through the Ecumenical HIV and AIDS Initiative and Advocacy, for short, WCC EHIA. Mm-hmm. And very recently, a project took me to Calabar, the capital of Cross River State here in Nigeria, about 5 weeks ago. And I encountered a pastor who came to share his experience with me that he is out of job because he disclosed his HIV position as being positive with the members of his church. And because of that, he lost his job. And a lot of people started stigmatizing him, and a lot of people do not want to associate with him anymore. And recently, I got to know that the Nigerian government has passed a law against stigmatization, anti-stigmatization law, that it is now an offense for you to discriminate against anyone with who is HIV positive. And this is very important that we continue the work of emphasizing this particular position. It is important that the faith actors would themselves take these matters up. So at the CCN, we are doing our best, bringing people together from time to time, conducting seminars, conducting workshops to make sure that people get to know that these things are now something that has been covered by the law of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. We have these two focal states as the moment where we are working, Plateau State in the north and Cross River State in the south. And our experiences has been so enormous because we educate the people. We, go on advocacy visits to enlighten our people and to let them understand that people who are living with HIV and AIDS are still our brothers and sisters, and the church should stand for them, to defend them, and to speak on their behalf. So it is important. I am happy that we are part of this program, and we look forward to WCC and the higher doing so much with us in 2021 and beyond. Let us not stop the work. It is important that we continue to educate our people. We continue to be the voice of the voiceless. And the church must continue to stand in the gap for people who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that intervention, Reverend Evans. We really do appreciate it. I think that that may bring us to the end of our questions. Francesca, are we at a point where we should go ahead and close? I think we are about on time.
Yes, Sandy, thank you very much. And it would be great if there are additional questions or comments, if you can put them down in the chat box. We are going to make sure to follow up with you later.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, presenters, for your really wonderful presentations. And we look forward to sharing this information with the group as we go forward. And I think that brings us to our second panel today, which is going to be facilitated by my friend and colleague, Pranessa Seal, who's the CEO and founder of the Balm in Gilead. Pranessa, are you with us?
I am. Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you so much. It's been a while, and it's so good to see you, and to all of my colleagues this morning, this afternoon. Good day. Good day. I'm so happy to be a part of this very robust conversation on stigma and discrimination in the faith community on this very important Human Rights Day. And certainly it's a day that's very important, but one that we wish we did not need. And that is why we do this work, because why should we, in fact, have a Human Rights Day when we have to tackle stigma and discrimination, especially among faith leaders who are governed by the love and laws of God, which is bound by love. But I am happy to facilitate this meeting. As Sandy said, I am the founder of the Balm in Gilead, and we've been working on this issue for 32 years. For 32 years, we've been in the trenches of addressing stigma and discrimination around HIV/AIDS within faith communities in Africa and throughout here in the United States. So we're going to get right on into this, and I believe, Francesca, we're going to start this session off with a video, stigma and discrimination in Zimbabwe. Is that correct? Okay, all right. So let's move on from the video. We'll come back to it, I assume. On my agenda, it's first. Our first presentation is the Global Partnership to End Stigma and Discrimination and the People Living with HIV Stigma Index Study and its impact. So we will turn it over to Alexandria and Omar, and would you please introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Dr. Seal. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. My name is Omar Sharif. I'm with the Global Network of Living with HIV, GNP+. And in this opportunity on this Human Rights Day, we would like to share our work in addressing stigma and discrimination. As Dr. Seal briefly mentioned, we'll present two approaches that we're currently working on in addressing stigma and discrimination. So the first one is the People Living with HIV Stigma Index. Next slide, please. So this is just an intro, but I think a lot of us is quite familiar with PLHIV Stigma Index. But just to quickly mention that Stigma Index is a tool developed for people living with HIV to document stigmatized and discriminatory experiences of PL-HIV community. And it was developed around 2007, and it's been used worldwide in more than 100 countries, with more than 100,000 people living with HIV participated in the study. And currently, GNP Plus is the host of International Partnership of PL-HIV Stigma Index, and with support from ICW, International Community of Women Living with HIV, and UNAIDS. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, this tool was created by and for people living with HIV. So what's unique about Stigma Index is this is not solely a research activity. Yes, the first part is to gather evidence by doing research, but the next part, which is the most important part, is how we use the data for advocacy purpose. And throughout the process, Stigma Index also foster capacity strengthening for PL-HIV network at country level, and also embracing gender equality and diversity among people living with HIV. Next slide. Again, I wanted to stress on how important is the advocacy part, because we all know without the use of the data that's already gathered, then it will stay in itself and remains like only publication, but does not really reach the desired impact we all want to see. So we want to make sure that the data that's compiled through the Stigma Index research will be used in many advocacy channels. One that I can mention, which will be presented in more detail with my colleague, is by using the global partnership to eliminate all form of HIV-related stigma and discrimination. And I also want to mention, we just recently launched a toolkit to be used for our country network in terms on how they can use the data for advocacy purpose. And what's interesting is because we have our colleague who's in the previous session who's working on human rights treaty body, and this is another area that we want to use to channel or to use the data that we've been compiling. Next slide. So now I want to showcase the work that we did together with our network in Zimbabwe, and why this video is very relevant to our event today is because, one, we want to celebrate the World Human Rights Day, and secondly, we want to also celebrate the work of community initiative in addressing stigma and discrimination. And this video that you will see is where the networks in Zimbabwe of doing Stigma Index and do some follow-up action on the situation in religious settings. So it's very relevant to our discussion today. Next slide.
Ine ndinonzi Patience Madari, ndine makore 49 ekuzvarwa. Ndakange ndakambororwa asi takasiyana nemurume wangu. Ndine vana 3 nevazukuru 2. Ndinogara kuGlenview 1 Extension, asi ndichishanda kuMbare panonzi paSt Michael's Primary School, ndo pandinodzidzisa. Ndinomiririra vana like guidance and counseling, ndichivadzidzisa magariro atingaitewo. Zvakare ndiri focal person we HIV and AIDS, stigma reduction and discrimination. kurarama ari HIV positive. Asi ndakanga ndisingakwanise kuita open up. Mai vangu chaivo zvakanditorera nguva kuti ndivaudze, because mai vangu munhu uye aitaura zviri negative about vanhu vanorwara, because munhu aishanda muhospital aiona zvakawanda. And vanhu vamwe vanenge vaine mentality yekuti kana munhu uri HIV positive maybe unenge uchiita zvekuita zvevarume vakawanda kana kuti zvekupinda-pinda.
The People Living with HIV Stigma Index has been widely recognized as an effective tool in monitoring stigma and discrimination among people living with HIV within the community. And it has been used to inform policy development and also HIV service delivery. At the same time, the participants of the Stigma Index study are also empowered by the process and benefit from networking as well as a referral to health services that they may be needing.
The Stigma Index research that was carried out was beneficial really in that it prompted the church into action. We then said and agreed to say we will continue with the focal persons who are at the schools and now train them on stigma and discrimination reduction.
Saka kutrainwa kwataitwa taidzidziswa kuti zvii zvinosanganikwa nazvo nevanhu muma-communities, even muma-schools. Uye kana vanhu vasangana nema-situations iwayo like zvekusarudzwa, tinopinda sei pane pacho pazviri kubvira kuti tigone kudzidzisa kuti vanenge vachiita kakusarudza kacheka vaonewo kunzwisisa pamusoro pemaconditions eHIV and AIDS. Nekudzidziswa kwandakaita neruzivo rwandanarwo through Stigma Index program iyi, ndamunhu ava empowered akugona kusangana nematambudziko uye nekutodzidzisawo vamwe kuti vanokwanisa kuzvimirirawo sei nekugara kwakanaka. Ende toda kutenda Mwari kuti this program even mumachurches munopiwa time yekuti kana uine zvakutaura 1 minute or 2 minutes wototaurawo uchidzidzisawo vanhu vari muchechi imomo, zvokuti even kana vakazonzwa kuti mainhingi vari kurarama neutachiwana vanokuakomodheta, havazokusarudzi. Vana vangu vavawo kuzivawo kuti mangwana havachasangani nesituation idzodzo nekuti vanenge vaakuziva zvekuita through ruzivo rwandakavapa rwandakawanawo inini.
Thank you. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sasha to present our second approach. Sasha, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Omar, and a very exciting video, really. And I will talk a bit. Louisa in the beginning started to talk about that. I will talk about the global partnership. The global partnership to eliminate stigma and discrimination. Can we open the slides as well, Francesca, please, if it is possible? So the Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate All Forms of HIV-related Stigma and Discrimination, it is a new initiative which is co-convened by JNP+, by UNAIDS, by PCB NGO delegation, by UN Women and UNDP, and very recently Global Fund actually joined the Global Partnership as a co-convener. So the Global Partnership is the aim is to accelerate actions around stigma and discrimination. And we basically have, as already Louisa mentioned, we already have started to invite the countries. We have done the new evidence. She also showed you, and I can later send into the chat box the link to the to the new evidence document, which is actually showing what can be the interventions in the 6 settings. And then we go next slide, please. So global partnership is actually focusing on the exact interventions, which can be done in a different settings. So what can be done, how it can be measured, and basically given the political framework for these actions to happen. Next slide, please. So we have invited by now 30 countries, but we're going to invite more. And the countries have to commit to do the actions. They have to choose the settings where they're going to do the actions. And some of the countries have already chosen the settings, some have not. Next slide, please. So you see the list of the countries and list of the settings which were chosen by these countries. We're also going in spring to invite more countries to join the global partnership. Next slide. So what is actually the country's promise? What is the political commitment there? They promise that they will make, together with the communities, UN partners, academia, private sector, donors, and other stakeholders. And I think I'm absolutely sure that the faith community have to be one of these stakeholders. It is essential that you have to be at the table, you have to be involved. Now in these countries, we have the process of the consultations between UN, between communities, between the governments. I think I just wanted today, you know, to bring that to your attention and to invite all of you to take part in these consultations and to be part of that process, because I think it is essential that you would be involved, you know, from the very beginning. Then the governments have to identify for this first year 3 settings where they want to focus their interventions. Then over the next 5 years, they have to make interventions in all of 6 settings on the global partnership. They have to allocate resources, they have to estimate what's going on, and STIGMA index is one of the tools how they can do that. They have to allocate resources and then implement the interventions. And then they have to monitor and input annually to the global level on the progress which they have achieved. Next slide. So it means that there is a clear commitment, clear promise from the side of the governments what they're gonna do and what it is they promise and who have to be involved into the process. Global partnership, the structure of the global partnership is looking at the stigma and discrimination that it is established in a different settings. So we are dividing stigma and discrimination and defining it in a setting such as household, workplace, educational settings, justice and healthcare settings, and emergency and humanitarian settings. I think that such settings as household, education, healthcare, and emergency and humanitarian settings are most essential for faith-based organizations, faith community to be involved in, because I'm absolutely sure it is an important part, and we won't reach real progress in that settings in reduction of stigma and discrimination if we won't be able to involve properly the faith-based organization, the faith community. I just wanted to very briefly, you know, to talk about the settings. So the way how we look at the individual household and community settings, you can see these are the examples of the most relevant interventions which can be done in these settings. You will find more information in a much more, you know, broader and more details in the evidence doc. But this is just to give you understanding like what kind of interventions we mean. And I think that many of these interventions can be absolutely applicable for faith organizations because they speak about like essential things like ensure access to gender-based violence services, for example, or develop strategies to cope with internalized and anticipated stigma. individual counseling, like things like that. So I think it's absolutely doable and very appropriate for faith organizations to be involved in that. So the household level, I think the role of the faith organization on that level is just remarkable. I think that raising awareness, providing knowledge amongst the families, ensure that the practices of to not promote further stigma and discrimination, and to protect affected populations. I think it's absolutely, relevant, and it's an obligation, and it is the gap which can be filled. And of course, on the community level, provide the community spaces, engage and train community leaders, women groups, youth groups, very essential to be for the faith organization to be involved and to implement. And of course, in educational settings, we just saw the video, very great video actually, about how it is important to work in schools and to work around the stigma and discrimination, and how faith-based leaders can also contribute to that. I think that establish such a peer mentor programs, make safe spaces and community programming, and to support and teach kids about living with HIV, and to engage parents, all that can be absolutely done and should bring a very good results. Is of course about the healthcare settings. In the healthcare settings, it is essential that it have to be stigma and discrimination free. Otherwise, people won't go there. Otherwise, they won't get the services and treatment, and they won't get tested. They won't get treated. So it is the essential part of work for to reduce stigma and discrimination in the healthcare settings. And I also think that in some regions, in some countries, faith organizations are playing a great role in the healthcare settings. And involvement and understanding and working with the service providers is essential obligation to be fulfilled by your community. And we're absolutely ready and would be very happy from the side of the GNP Plus to work together to reduce stigma and discrimination in these settings. I think that's it from my side. I try to be very, very short. My call, I think, is clear. Go to in the countries which have already joined the global partnership. Go and start to get involved, and I can definitely support you in that process. Go and start to get involved into the national consultations process. Start to implement the interventions together with the people in HIV organizations and other stakeholders. We really need you at the table. I think in some of the settings, your involvement is absolutely crucial. So I'm just giving, of course, I'm ready to answer all the questions, and you can reach out. I will also provide my contact details so that we can discuss, each of the countries, each of the situations, because of course they are very different. And hope to work together. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that great presentation from both you and Omar. We've learned a lot, and that was very, very, very good. And now we're going to move right along to introduction to the framework for dialogue, methodology, process, impact, and limitation. So I'm going to send it over to Francesca and those in this session to introduce yourself and move forward. Thank you.
Okay, Pernessa, thank you very much. This is Jacek again, and I have a pleasure to co-present this part of the session together with Francesca and Dr. Kurian, who is heading the Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance of the World Council of Churches. Let me start that I'm really amazed with the richness of the content so far, and really showing me a lot of synergies among what we as multi-stakeholder coalition of partners are delivering around our key issues of addressing HIV-related stigma and discrimination. So the framework for dialogue, this is the platform established for the dialogue between religious leaders, faith partners, and networks of people living with HIV. And it is a unique tool for dialogue and joint action at the national level. We will go in this presentation very quickly through, step by step, through the key elements of the framework for dialogue methodology. We will tell you how we have developed it, and we definitely present way forward and discuss the content as necessary and as time permits, because I'm looking at the time now, we are quite late. So Francesca, to you.
Okay, hello? Okay, sorry, apologies for this. So I will start from the very beginning. I was just saying that this slide showed the essence of the framework for dialogue methodology, which then brings together networks of people living with HIV and religious leaders, as well as other key players in the HIV response at national level, for a joint dialogue or a series of joint dialogues which are based on evidence. And then together, the people concerned, the different stakeholders concerned, identify joint actions to address stigma and discrimination with the purpose to promote greater access to HIV services to everyone. But also it is meant to create environments in places of worship that really are supportive for everyone living with HIV, and also sharing prevention information in places of worship. So the framework for dialogue provides practical steps to help faith communities, people living with HIV, as well as other key partners in the national HIV response, to effectively address key issues of concern which limit access to HIV services. At the first dialogue event, it is the people who are coming together are going to discuss the different perceptions and experience and beliefs that are relating to HIV. And then they are going to identify common actions. But what it is really important, an important piece, an essential piece of the framework for dialogue is the evidence. And the entire process starts with the stigma, the people living with HIV stigma index report. And at the same time, we need to look at the evidence that is generated from others' reports on activities on stigma and discrimination reduction intervention that are taking place already in the country. The framework for dialogue does not intend to replace any existing dialogues or collaboration that on stigma and discrimination that is taking place in a specific country, but what it does is that brings together all the different activities and information. And then it is via a methodology grounded in evidence that generate action. These two words, partnership and evidence, are the essence, and again, very critical for the framework for dialogue methodology. So we need to think about partnership and evidence from the moment we start the implementation, we start the process, and then we work on the implementation. And we need to look at the potential power of strong, lasting partnership. The framework for dialogue is based on two basic premises. The networks of people living with HIV, religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and faith communities all play a different yet critical role in the response to HIV, and sustain and strengthen evidence-based dialogue and mutual respect will not only enhance the effectiveness of each stakeholder's action, but will also result in new joint action that will increase the effectiveness of responses to HIV overall. The process is going to be effective only if we ensure the participation and actually the full participation of people living with HIV. And the people living with HIV stigma index forms the central part of this evidence base, alongside, as I said, with all other materials and reports on stigma and discrimination intervention that are taking place in the country. Implementing the people living with HIV stigma index then becomes essential before the framework for dialogue methodology can begin. And as I mentioned at the very beginning here, we are looking at addressing stigma and discrimination to promote greater access to HIV services to all. But at the same time, we want to promote a greater quality of life of people living with HIV in places of worship. This slide shows where the framework for dialogue process has already taken place or it is undergoing. So we see that the framework for dialogue has started actually in 2013 with implementation in Myanmar. We had framework for dialogue processes in India. The process is undergoing in Ukraine. It took place in Malawi, in Nigeria. It's undergoing in the United States. And we had the framework for dialogue methodology and process already implemented 4 times in Kenya, 2 at national level and 2 at county levels. I want to share with you some of the success stories from 2 of the countries where the dialogue has been implemented. One is from Malawi, and the framework for dialogue has strengthened a formal linkage between religious leaders and people living with HIV, which was not present before. The initiative has also initiated a debate on some of the sensitive issues, and in particular, we have identified religious leaders who became champions against homophobia. And finally, a work policy for people living with HIV has been put in place for engaging and involving people living with HIV in places of worship. In Ethiopia, it has been mainly the Orthodox Church that has been involved, but one important piece to share is that the framework for dialogue is an interfaith activity, really brings together the different faith leaders group in the country. So in Ethiopia was primarily the Orthodox Church, though, that was involved. And they developed a sermon guide for religious leaders to address stigma and discrimination and violence against women, but also to promote prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Another important outcome has been that religious leaders have been equipped with this information and skill in these areas. And also they really became agents of change in their places of worship. Under the UNAIDS PEPFAR Faith Initiative, the framework for dialogue will take place in 2021 in Nigeria, Tanzania, and DRC. What I wanted to share here with you is that there's going to be also a multi-country sharing experience where different actors, so faith-based organizations, religious leaders, civil society organization, people living with HIV, governments representatives, UN agencies, and many more are going to come together to share stigma and discrimination reduction intervention that are effective. And then we are going to identify some key priority intervention, and we are going to also look at ways of replicating them, including discussion on possible funding sources for their implementation in countries. Some of this discussion is going to look in particular and take into consideration the situation faced by migrants, IDPs, refugees, and trafficked people living with HIV.
Again, trying to unmute, thank you. When we started the discussion with partners around the development of the framework some years ago, and by partners I mean faith partners and GNP Plus, INRELA Plus, we did an analysis of what is really happening, and the analysis showed what we heard already several times today during the discussion and within the presentations and comments from the participants. And these 4 main findings are very clear to us. Stigma and discrimination continues to face people living with HIV. People living with HIV believe that faith sector not only can, but also should help addressing the stigma and discrimination. And they experience, based on their experience in their own communities and groups. 4th finding is that addressing internal stigma experienced by people living with HIV is an area where faith communities and religious leaders can offer unique support and enable positive change. And the 4th one is that faith is of high importance in the lives of people living with HIV. Nothing new here. Many of these issues were mentioned during the discussions today. I liked very much from the film by GNP Plus, these pieces of data showing that until today, until recently, until now actually, because it is very fresh material, we had something like over 10% of people living with HIV excluded from religious services. While Framework for Dialogue does not limit the discussions to stigma, I think it offers a unique opportunity for finding the optimal ways of addressing it through the open, transparent, and evidence-based dialogue of religious and faith partners with people living with HIV. I'm now requesting Dr. Manos Kurian to continue.
Friends, just to quickly go through the principles of the Framework for Dialogue, there are 8 clear principles. The first is that the whole process is country-based. So it is directed and guided by the needs of the country and the country partners. It's also important to understand that all actions are, the second is it's evidence-based. It has been mentioned many times that all actions are based on evidence, qualitative and qualitative. The third point is that it's people-centered. The dialogue is not about what faith institutions are doing or about their actions, but actually what are the actions and their impact on people, the actions or the lack of it. The fourth principle is do no harm. That is, all participants in the process agree to this approach, especially when they tend to disagree on issues. So it is clear that we should not end up with more problems than when we started. The next is the fifth principle is the equal and meaningful participation. All stakeholders enter into this dialogue as equal partners, allowing full participation, and they sit around the table as equal, even if they are a senior religious leader, government official, or person living with HIV. The sixth principle is innovation. New partnerships are formed. We are expected to think out of the box, and we don't do things just because we have done it like that all the time. And the seventh is that the whole process is action-oriented. The focus of the process is to go beyond dialogue and for collaborative and cooperative, constructive actions, participatory action. And the last and eighth the principle is safe spaces. The methodology and the facilitation of the dialogue aims to create a space where all who enter into dialogue are sure that they do not meet discrimination or judgment, or and their confidentiality is maintained. So we just go into some of the key elements of the framework. One is on the specific objectives. The specific objective, of course, is to support and develop the sustainability of relationships, partnerships, long-term partnerships, encompassing both the collaboration between the people living with HIV networks and faith-based organizations and religious leaders, as well as key partners. The second is to support the collection, analysis, and the use of evidence on the experiences and the perceptions of people living with HIV within their own faith communities. The third is the support and collection and analysis and the use of evidence in the response of HIV to HIV of faith communities and religious leaders. Then we also expect to support the documentation and sharing of good policy and practices, as well as lessons learned to overcome these challenges that people living with HIV face. As you heard in the discussions, it's still being experienced in many countries. And the final, the objective is to address the barriers to access and to HIV services identified in the Stigma Index report and other relevant reports. Next slide, please. Then we go into the outcomes. The desired outcome, one is clearly strengthen country level responses from all the faith communities and religious leaders and networks of people living with HIV. It is expected that working together, addressing the key concerns, the you will strengthen this response. Then second is to strengthen strengthen the sustainable collaboration and mutual understanding among religious leaders and people living with HIV, as well as other partners. And this, it leads to the third, that there would be a strengthening and improvement of participation of people living with HIV in the quality of access to to faith institutions, be it educational, be it other institutions of the faith, and very importantly, places of worship. The fourth point is that this also would lead to improved access to HIV-related services for people living with HIV and vulnerable to HIV, and those who are vulnerable to HIV, with the support of faith communities and their leaders. And this would lead to, hopefully, the improved quality of life of people living with HIV. And all this is hoped that would bring an outcome where there's increased engagement and visibility of religious leaders in responding to the HIV pandemic, including activities that lead to reduction of stigma. So the framework clearly starts with the review of evidence and continues to use the evidence as the basis for dialogue. So it is not, the dialogue is not based on some wishful thinking, but clear evidence. And this leads to joint action between religious leaders and faith-based organizations and networks of people living with HIV. And the first key step is actually the creation of a national working group to oversee the implementation of the framework for dialogue. And this is central. It is this working group that will ensure that these 8 principles that I elaborated on the framework for dialogue is upheld throughout the entire process. And once formed, the working group oversees the implementation in the following next steps. I will just enumerate it, and Francisca will elaborate it a little bit more. So first is initiating the dialogue, then preparing for the face-to-face dialogue meeting, then understanding the evidence and the perceptions, holding the first dialogue. Step 5 is planning, executing, and monitoring longer-term dialogue and collaborative actions. And finally, continuing this dialogue and reviewing it and learning from experience. Obviously, this is not just a one-off, but it's a whole long and sustainable process.
Thank you, Manoj. So I'm just going to briefly go through these slides. I'm not going to present all the details because of time. Just one important element, the creation of the working group. The methodology is very precise about who is going to lead the working group and the activities. But what the working group has to do is also to look at all evidence on stigma and discrimination intervention. I want to move to an important piece of the activities, which is the one around the implementation piece. So once the dialogue has taken place and the different stakeholders come together, it's important that they work together on a long-term action plan. And this is a long-term action plan on stigma and discrimination. It has to take into consideration the national HIV strategy, and it also needs then for the outcomes of the FATE initiative to be included in the FATE action plans that the countries of the initiative are going to develop. The working group is also a long-term working group, which needs that we need to start from the very beginning to think about resources and ways to make sure that the working group is going to be able in the long term to function. So mobilization of resources is also an essential component of the entire process, and as well as the monitoring and evaluation piece. It has been and it is always very difficult to measure the impact of stigma and discrimination intervention by faith groups, but stigma and discrimination intervention in general. So precise indicators and measures need to be identified at the very beginning of the process. And it's also very important to work on documenting and sharing the success, challenges, and lessons learned. And we are going to have an example from Inarela plus Kenya after on the implementation of the framework for dialogue. They have been really capable of capturing all the different lessons learned as well as the challenges. So they're going to talk about that. And because this is a process, the dialogue or the dialogues meetings can take place several times. But what is really important is that we make the dialogues action-oriented, so that very clear action are identified and then implemented.
Just to reiterate that the foundation of the framework for dialogue is evidence, and it is evidence not only it is not only the basis of the dialogue, but it's also the tool that aims to support. So we need to bring about change in actual lived experience of the people living with HIV. And just one point for you to remember that how was this developed? This originated in the high-level religious leaders summit on HIV, which took place in 2010. Which was a very, very landmark meeting where 40 over religious leaders from different faith communities got together and made personal commitments. And this was organized by the Advocacy Alliance at the time, and the GNP Plus and the Inarela Plus and UNAIDS. And the framework for dialogue process came out of that. And it has been and that has led to this process because it is a participatory process, and that is the proof that such an activity, which is based on evidence, which is also that we are result oriented and depend on what actually is how we are going to make a difference in people's lives, is actually a sustainable process. Thank you.
So this slide provides some references to resources and templates. Obviously, what is the key issue here is that the framework for dialogue methodology will be and is accessible to those countries that are implementing it. In our particular moment, we're talking about DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, and Nigeria. And I'm really happy to see among participants quite a number of colleagues from the networks, as well as from the faith actors from these countries. I think that with the progress in this exercise, which is definitely considered as one of the key milestones of the UNAIDS for Faith initiative, we will be connecting other countries to this process. Thank you very much. This is the last slide of our presentation. Pernessa, to you.
Well, thank you very, very much for that. That was very informative, and we can see that a lot of work has gone into that. If you have, I want to remind you, if you have any questions and comments, please put them in the chat because we are clearly running out of time. We've heard that from the organizers. Let's move right on to Reverend Jane, the impact of the framework for dialogue in Kenya. Reverend Jane.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, morning, afternoon to all of us. I'll be speaking about the implementation of the framework for dialogue from the Kenyan perspective. Francesca, if I can have the slides. And just to say that we have used this tool or this methodology as a tool for stigma reduction here in Kenya. And what has really worked so well is the fact that we have been able to realize the findings of the stigma reduction. The findings of the stigma indexes. We have been able to incorporate it and be able to really have the religious leaders be at the fore in the implementation. Puts it up, let me start by saying that the Kenyan journey started after let's go to the next slide. There was a country-to-country sharing forum that was held here in Kenya. I think that should have been in 2013, if I'm not wrong. And we had Ethiopia, Malawi, and Uganda that had implemented the framework for dialogue methodology. And we were invited just to hear how it works. And we realized that was the gap that was missing in terms of the engagement of the faith sector here in Kenya, bringing together evidence and people living with HIV and having religious leaders and everyone at the table to discuss the issues. Next, please. So we held our first national dialogue, and of course, before that, we formed a committee that brought together people living with HIV, religious leaders. We had development partners. We even had the National AIDS Control Council and different players at the table. We formed the committee, and then we started the implementation. And our initial national dialogue was very successful. And let's go to the next slide. And we were able to look at the evidence that was there then. We had just concluded a stigma index, and we had many issues that had emerged, some from the faith sector and some of the lived experiences that people living with HIV shared. We dialogued, and then we developed joint actions. Next. Among the key dialogue joint actions focused on the need to break the silence around HIV stigma, because, and these four were taken as the top priority. In as much as religious leaders were engaging in stigma reduction, they were bringing on board interventions that they thought were best for people living with HIV. And there were testimonies from different people living with HIV saying that the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV within congregations equals to being given an opportunity to sing a song during a Sunday service, or just to be recognized. And there was now, and of course that would fuel more stigma. So one of the top priorities was the need to break the silence. The second one, facilitate dialogue at different levels within the faith-based institutions, because the initial dialogue was at the national level. We felt there was need to cascade it down. There was also the priority around spearheading joint advocacy efforts for safer and healthier living of people living with HIV. And a lot has happened around the joint advocacy efforts since that dialogue. The fourth one was on how to change how religious leaders and people living with HIV relate. And we realized there was a lot of back and forth, people living with HIV blaming religious leaders blaming people living with HIV, and there was now the mutual understanding. Next. There were issues that came up that we felt needed further dialogue, and one of them was the whole issue around sexual and reproductive health. And I'm grateful that even after holding the initial dialogue, we've been able to dialogue and even theologically reflect on some of these issues, the issue of sexual and reproductive health, the issue of faith healing, and the issue of HIV prevention. They came out very strongly as issues that really need constant dialogue and understanding at the table on how to go about it. After the dialogue meeting, we started off the implementation, and we realized we needed to provide religious leaders with tools that would enable them to be able to become more effective in their work. And one of them was to provide HIV messaging that was theologically reflected and that religious leaders could resonate with. I think for the longest time, there was the use of the ABC strategy as a way of HIV prevention, and religious leaders kept feeling that this is not our message. And therefore, we had theological reflections, developed sermon guides for religious leaders so that they could be able to address children and HIV-related issues, and within it incorporated advocacy issues around pediatric HIV treatment and how communities can engage. And this tool or this sermon guide is available for both Muslims and the Christians. And this was done at an interfaith level, incorporating also people living with HIV. Next. The other focus was on gender-based violence. There was the realization that there was a need to focus on how to prevent gender-based violence and sexual violence, not just towards people living with HIV, but in the community at large. And there has been now the development of messaging, which has been packaged in a booklet that has been supported by the National AIDS Control Council. And we have now messages on stigma reduction, messages on SGBV, messages on male engagement, and many other issues packaged together. And that tool now available for religious leaders to use in a simple language, having scriptures, and really helping them to understand the issues. Next. The whole component again on male involvement or male engagement also became one of the issues that we needed to focus on after the dialogue. And there has been a lot. And one of the key things that has happened is that because of the patriarchal nature of the faith communities, a lot of the faith leaders have come out and they want to lead by example, and we'll be shortly be looking at some of the messages they are sharing out there as a way of enhancing male involvement in the HIV agenda. Next. We have also been able to document, as Inerela Kenya, a lot of the work we are doing around stigma reduction, and a lot of these voices of religious leaders living with HIV, coming out to share their stories, some coming out to share how they were stigmatizing and now they have stopped, they are more supportive to people living with HIV, and a lot of documentation has gone. Post-dialogue, there has been, we have reviewed, and these are some of the things that we are learning, that there is need to ensure that we create safe spaces and avenues for people living with HIV to participate in faith activities and in decision making within the faith communities. They need to have the safe spaces, and the framework for dialogue has allowed that to happen. And the second one is around congregational responses focused on support groups formation and support and pastoral home visits. They have increased after the implementation of the framework for dialogue, because the barriers have been broken and there's better understanding and there's more synergy that is being created between religious leaders and people living with HIV, and not only through the religious leaders but also members of the congregation, because when they see the pastor or the imam supportive and walking and journeying with people living with HIV, they also feel this is the right thing to do. Then the third one is that the language of religious leaders has changed to non-judgmental, non-stigmatizing, and one that respects human dignity, because religious leaders are also learning from people living with HIV. And when something is said and a religious leader is corrected that is not the correct language, then the religious leaders, because there is now a relationship, they are able to take that from a positive perspective and understanding. Therefore, stigma has continued to reduce. There has been an impact assessment that has been conducted based on the framework for dialogue methodology. And the report is ready. I think it's something that we can share. And it has really shown that, how the methodology is working and the impact that it has created. The other issue, as I said earlier, is that the religious leaders are stepping up to join the Live the Promise campaign. And there's a lot that is happening. We'll share the link so that you see the messaging that is going out. There has been joint press releases with UNAIDS and WCC, EAA, together with Inerela Kenya, and a lot of that has happened. And then there has also been press conferences held with the media just to engage them on how to eliminate stigma. Post-dialogue, also implementation is that there has been initiation of the dialogue at congregational level. We've had religious leaders that have taken it personal to their own congregations. They have started integrating HIV messages in sermons, inviting people living with HIV for breakfast. They have formed support groups. They have set aside Sunday, one Sunday every month for HIV dissemination. There has also been the cascading of the dialogues at the county level and having dialogue working groups at the county level. And there has also been advocacy initiatives that are going on. Just a bit on the lessons that we have learned. They need to have a clear monitoring plan for post-dialogue is very, very important. There is need for continuous provision of technical support to religious leaders. And of course, we were receiving a lot of that from Francesca and others, and we were able to provide that to the religious leaders. County dialogue, level dialogues, they are critical. Cascading that down from the national level, even to the congregational level, is very important. And for effectiveness in stigma reduction, congregational dialogues are critical. There is need to have county level support committees, and there is also need to for enhanced evidence within the programs that are happening. These are some of the attitudes or felt attitudes by people living with HIV after the implementation. There are some who have said, I've sensed love in the congregation, I have sensed understanding, and a lot of this has been shared in the impact assessment, which I believe we will share after this. So as I finish and as Francesca puts up those photos, I just want to say that it is also very important that we ensure we are sustaining these working interventions, because we have tested, we have seen the framework of dialogue is working. Please, please, as we even open up new frontiers in different countries for its implementation, let us also look into how do we sustain these good results that we are seeing in the countries that the framework for dialogue has been implemented. That's a bishop within the Anglican Church giving a message around HIV testing. That's Imam from the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims in Siaya County, talking about male engagement, a church member in one of the congregations. So these are some of the messages that we have been able to develop, interfaith in nature, just as a result of the implementing, the framework for dialogue and engaging religious leaders. They are more open, more relaxed, and happy to be involved because the barriers have been broken. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much for that great presentation to the entire, all of our panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the work that clearly has gone into these presentations. It is now time to open up for discussion and questions. I have been looking through the chat. Most of us have given our comments. So if you have questions, you may want to turn on your video and raise your hand, and you can be recognized that way. But I know most of you want to know how can you get copies of these resources. So Francesca, I'm going to ask that question of you to answer. How can everyone get copies?
Thank you, Dr. Panissa. So we're going to share copies of the presentation with all the participants. And we are also going to share additional information about the methodology and the link to the framework for dialogue information, as well as the stigma index and the video that was shared. I just want to answer, if I may, to a couple of questions that I saw in the chat box, and one is in relation to the participation of evangelical groups in the dialogues. Yes, we had experience of participation and collaboration with the evangelical groups, and maybe Reverend Jane can also talk about the Kenyan experience, and it was actually a very positive participation. And in many countries where the dialogue has taken place, we have been working with strong collaboration with the network of religious leaders living with HIV or personally affected by HIV, as well as with the networks of people living with HIV. And as I mentioned during the presentation, we have ensured the participation of interfaith groups as much as possible. And there was also a question from Ibrahim around how to connect and link the Faith for Stigma toolkit with the framework for dialogue. I think that this is a discussion that we need to have together. I think it would be interesting once the working group for the new implementation in countries are going to be set up, if we can have a conversation with our participation and engagement as well. I think that your commitment, we said 16 and 8 are clearly referring to stigma and discrimination. But we can really expand and look at how to better integrate the two pieces together and make human rights really a stronger part of the framework for dialogue.
If Dr. Pernisa allows me, this is Jacek. I want to add one comment here because Ibrahim's question has a wider context, and I think Francesca is addressing it very well. The issue here that we should remember and we should commit to is that framework for dialogue is not an event. Framework for dialogue is a process leading to a sustainability of the faith partners' engagement into the AIDS response. Thus, we have to look at it from the point of view of the process, because one day UNAIDS will not exist, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights will not exist, many international and national structures will stop existing, but our faith partners will be definitely in place. And they will be responsible for many things that we are today assisting them to deliver, them and other country partners. So colleagues, my biggest plea out of this discussion is that let's not look at the framework for dialogue as an event or a meeting. Let's look at it as a sustainable platform for dialogue among key partners of the response. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so very much. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Reverend Dr. George Andrew, would you take up, unmute yourself, and we will hear your question or comment.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the presenter, for good presentation they have presented to us. Still, I have some observations. It's not a question, it's observations. The issue for stigma and discrimination is still problems, not only in Tanzania, even in other countries. And those organizations have been working hard to make sure that the religious leaders are involved much just to send the message to the church members in order to reduce stigma and discrimination. Despite the effort made by the organization, still the problem is persisting in some countries like Tanzania. This happens because some of the youth, especially in the university level, are having HIV/AIDS. And this happened because the economic situation of their parents and and the dependent, the guardians is very poor, and they cannot afford to support them. Since the problem is still increasing, I would like to propose, if possible, the government and non-government organization to make sure that people should go to test, not only testing, but also to use medicines. Finally, they should be disclosed to the people so they get to know who has been affected with and who is living with. So this will be helpful to reduce the stigma among the community members. This is my observation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Anyone? Any more comments or questions?
Yes, thank you so much. This is Gabriel from Nigeria. Thanks so much for the great presentations we've had so far. I just wanted to ask if the extent to which the stigma index tool is adaptable to have a section that speaks to stigma and discriminatory related issues within the faith setting or within the church or the mosque setting, so that when you are using the evidence from the stigma index to inform your framework for dialogue, the faith leaders can relate to the the evidence that has been presented coming from what happens in their community. So I wanted to inquire the extent to which we can be able to have that kind of mainstreaming of faith as it's applied to the faith-related stigma as it applies to the faith settings, Muslims and Christians. And I was also going to add, I had related, each time we have this kind of dialogue, we find essentially only the mainstream churches participating, the leadership participating. There are a lot of demographics. There are also a lot of acceptance of certain related issues within the Pentecostal and the evangelicals. So we were trying to say the extent to which the examples being shared, the experiences being shared, relate to what happens in the Pentecostal or evangelical setting, the extent to which the leadership from these settings participate and translate what happens there into their congregation. And I was asking that conscious of the fact that within the evangelicals, we have the various dynamics that takes place there that we actually need to really take cognizance of. And I was also going to inquire the extent to which we are able to measure what happened thereafter the dialogue. What happened? How are we sure that the framework for dialogue and the resolutions, the discussions are actually translated to what happens within the faith community, measured in a way and manner that it provides evidence for us to present, not just by way of maybe the spirit directs. Thank you, over.
And thanks for the question. I think right now in Stigma Index tool, the questionnaire, we have very limited question which directly linked to the religious setting. And a Stigma Index tool is a standardized tools, meaning you cannot reduce and you cannot add question to that main questionnaire. But what we do is we provide flexibility for country who implementing Stigma Index to do additional process on top of the main questionnaire. So for instance, if Nigeria wants to dive deep into stigma issues in religious setting, GNP Plus, we can facilitate that. So the religious group in Nigeria will work together with our network affiliation in Nigeria, which is NEP1. And I believe Abdul Qadir is also here in this event. So that's how it works in terms of if there's any country-specific issues that needs to be addressed, in more detailed manner. That's how we usually do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Panissa, I'm going to respond to the question from Gabriel.
Yes.
Thank you. So it's regarding the frame of dialogue process, as I said, is a very strict methodology. We have developed surveys for the entire process. So because stigma and discrimination look at a lot at the attitudes of people and religious leaders towards people living with HIV, at the very beginning of the process, once the religious leaders are identified, they have to undergo and fulfill a survey. And we have surveys for different steps of the process. So we can really look at the way their attitude has been changing and what they have been putting in place and how they have implemented some of the actions that they have been identified. So there are surveys for the beginning of the process, during the dialogue events, 6 months after the process, and 18 months after the process. There are also specific reporting templates to try to capture and measure some of the implementation activities. But there is more work to be done in terms of which indicators and means of verification needs to be used for the different dialogue. And what we want to do, and we are trying to do, is to discuss with the global network of people living with HIV around, and other partners as well, of course, around ways in which we can better identify these indicators. And we also need to work with the governments to see what kind of specific indicators for stigma and discrimination reduction intervention are in place already in the countries.
Okay, it's also very clear in the framework for dialogue in terms of the criteria of the people who need to participate. And depending on the different structures that are in the country, it is very important to ensure that everyone is brought on board. It has to be, of course, interfaith in nature, but also ensuring that everyone is involved, from the evangelicals to the African instituted churches to the Pentecostals, ensure that everyone, in the formation of the committee, everyone is brought on board. Thank you.
Ah, ok, merci. Moi, je voulais seulement ici intervenir pour faire une suggestion à l'intention de nos amis leaders religieux pour leur dire qu'ils ont une lourde responsabilité, une grande responsabilité pour ce qui concerne la stigmatisation et la discrimination, comment y mettre fin. Moi, j'estime qu'il n'y a pas mieux que le milieu religieux pour pouvoir faire passer ce message-là, parce que c'est dans les églises où vous retrouvez toutes les couches de la population. La manière dont les pasteurs, les leaders religieux font passer la parole de Dieu à leurs adeptes, à leurs fidèles, ils peuvent en profiter aussi pour impliquer dans leur message le message concernant la stigmatisation et la discrimination, parce que en principe, l'Église, c'est elle qui rassemble le plus grand nombre de personnes. Donc, les leaders religieux devaient profiter de cette opportunité pour pouvoir faire passer ce message-là, pour dire que la stigmatisation et la discrimination, c'est contre l'amour du prochain, et prêcher le bon exemple par là. Parce que tout à l'heure, là, j'ai entendu un intervenant dire que au niveau de la RDC, ils ont eu à participer à des travaux. C'est bien beau de pouvoir participer à des travaux, c'est bien beau de prendre les engagements, mais il faut les suivis, il faut la sensibilisation. Quand nous parlons de la stigmatisation dans les niveaux des milieux religieux, c'est parce que nous en avons la preuve. Moi, je suis magistrat, je connais je connais des pasteurs qui sont en prison pour avoir fait pour divulguer l'état sérologique. Et là, moi, je crois qu'il y a un problème. Donc, moi, le message, je le fais passer au niveau des leaders religieux pour leur dire ils sont mieux placés pour nous aider, nous tous, à faire passer ce message, étant donné qu'ils sont écoutés par le plus grand nombre. Toutes les couches de la population sont des croyants, vont dans les églises. Alors, ce sont des opportunités qu'ils doivent profiter. Voilà ce que moi, je voulais dire. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are running. Do I see a hand over here? We are running. We have ran out of time, a matter of fact. But we do want to give you the opportunity to talk about opportunities for collaboration. I think that's been a running discussion throughout these very important presentations, challenges and opportunities. Certainly there are a lot of challenges, because we wouldn't have this conversation if there were not challenges, but there are opportunities. I think that I want to commend all of the great work that you all have been doing, and to reiterate that the framework is not an event, it is a process, and it is a long process. One of the challenges we have working with faith communities, and I'm a part of that community, is that the process is long, and we have to stay steadfast on the process. So in the interest of time, is there any other comments we want to uplift? Francesca, any of the leaders want to uplift anything on opportunities, challenges, opportunities, anything that you'd like to say before I turn it back over to Sandy?
Oui,
Yes.
merci. Je dis réellement que c'est une opportunité pour nous. Moi-même étant un révérend pasteur, je comprends la pertinence que nous puissions profiter de ce processus pour nous inscrire dans la durée. Et comme ça a été déjà déclaré, il y aura organisation du dialogue en 2021, ce qui est une bonne chose. mais je voulais savoir dans quel cadre. Est-ce que c'est, on va le faire de manière séparée ou le dialogue s'inscrira dans l'initiative ONU-SIDA PEPFAR? Ça, c'est ma question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So with that, any other recognition of hands?
Dr. Parisa, just a quick, just if you could, with appreciation to your facilitation, if you could, in closing this session, tell us at least, like in a very brief remark from your side about your recent publication related to stigma and discrimination. That would be highly appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I want to be cognizant of your time. A few years ago, and because of the Balm and Gilead's work, we wrote a book, Stand Up to Stigma, how we reject fear and shame. And the foundation of the book really is to look at all of the stigma and fears that we come with. We all of us on this in this work, we have our own individual fears, we have our own individual stigmas. We come into families, we come into our faith communities as children, and we learn. We learn these stigmas. These stigmas are handed down to us from generation to generation. The way we interpret scripture is handed down to us generation upon generation upon generation. And we find ourselves called to this moment to really look at, and I believe that we must look at ourselves and the fear that we carry, the stigma that we carry, the stigma that we have also felt in our community. I am stigmatized. I'm stigmatized as a woman. I'm stigmatized as an African American. I'm stigmatized because I'm also overweight. So I live in stigma. I realize the things that have shaped my life because of stigmas that I had nothing really to do with. So I think that one of the things that when we're looking at how we reject fear and shame is to really look at our own issues, our own selves, and be really clear and have our own internal perspective of how we have been affected by stigma and how we have also stigmatized others. And that brings us to exposing. We must expose the problem. As religious leaders who are called to this work, we cannot stand by and feel one way and not speak forward. One of the challenges we have in not rejecting stigma is that we feel one way, but we are silent. We're silent on the issues. We don't speak up, and we don't speak up because we are afraid of being stigmatized. And it is just not, in my opinion, it is just not fair for faith leaders not to stand up against any kind of persecution in the public square, because we honor our Jesus Christ, our leader, our Lord and Savior. Jesus Christ was persecuted, and we claim his persecution as our salvation. And I think because of that, we are asked to stand up. We are asked to stand up and expose stigma and stand up and say it. This fantastic work, this framework, this process of framework, it will go nowhere if we do not stand up, if we do not stand up and reject fear and stigma in the public square. For us to come together in like minds is great. This has been a phenomenal meeting, but the work begins when we leave this place. The work begins when we're talking with our colleagues in our other meetings that don't agree with us. Can we stand up and reject fear and stigma when we're not sitting in these places with like minds? We must change the language. We must work around media. Social media is so important, and yet it is so damaging. We are seeing the dismantle of a fabric of our world, the pros of social media and the cons of social media. It is a destructive force as well as it is a good force. And we must tackle this monster that is really destroying our countries, as well as it is such an important tool. Never before have we been faced with such a tool and an instrument that can build up as well as tear down. And we religious leaders, our religious communities, we are called to tackle this big monster. And again, we must change laws. We must be in the forefront of policies, and as many of us have spoken to in this meeting today. We must be there, and we must be at the forefront of policies within our religious sectors as well as in our governments. So, and the last piece is that it's really not that hard to stand up to stigma, because we are all called to love unconditionally. And if in fact we be objective, if we in fact honor what we are called to do, there would be no need for this conversation. If we were actually called to love our God, love our neighbor as ourselves, we would not have no purpose for this conversation. And that's why we go back to, we must look at ourselves and then step from that place and from this great meeting, and do the work of standing up to stigma and rejecting fear and shame. So thank you for the opportunity to share that. And we are way past now. So if it's okay with you, Professor Leader, I'm going to turn it over to Sandy. Is that okay? That's okay. Sandy, are you here?
Yes, ma'am. That was excellent. That was good preaching. Dr. Pranessa, we love that. Anyway, I want to thank you all for being with us today. And just to in summary, quickly, because we've had such a rich conversation. We talked about the fact that we still have challenges, serious challenges in DRC and all the countries where we work, and we know that and recognize that. We recognize the fact that there has been some incredible response on many fronts from all the unbelievable work that's been done in DRC with lawyers and magistrates and training people and creating clinics, with our colleagues at GNP Plus who have been engaging in the framework for dialogue and creating partnerships that really are making a difference. The call for the need for education and coordination from Kate and others, and the fact that listening to each other as people living with HIV, people who are engaged in the HIV work, and religious leaders, listening to each other, collecting the evidence, and being in that space where we're open to dialogue becomes so important. Recognizing that a dialogue of any kind that affects change is a very long process, but that we have a framework that is extraordinary, and we have faithful rights toolkits, as Ibrahim was discussing, that I think are really complementary, and we ought to have some additional conversation about that. And I think just to close on the fact that this needs, I think, to be the beginning of our ongoing conversation about the need to implement frameworks for dialogue and other kinds of tools that strengthen the coordination and communication between practitioners, groups of people living with HIV, and our faith leaders and communities around the world, to move us in a direction that won't only have impact on our work in COVID and HIV and other diseases, but will have a tremendous amount of, I think, impact on where we are in the world and how we are living together in this world that's probably needed now more than ever. And the thing that we have that gives us an advantage is that people are often able to agree on the fact that we care about the health of our families and our communities. And despite our differences, we can find a way to work together toward those goals. So I'll just close on that and turn it over to Francesca. And thank you all once again, speakers, for your incredible contributions, Pranessa for your great facilitation, and of course to Jacek and to Francesca for their leadership putting this together. Francesca?
On behalf of Francesca and
Sorry,
and UNAIDS team. Thank you very much. So let me be very brief. Big thank you to all participants, all presenters, all facilitators. Here I have to do a special thank to Marie-José, because her bringing the legal aspect of the problem to the discussion was absolutely fantastic. And I should reiterate that what you are doing in DRC by training other judges and lawyers in addressing human rights violations related to HIV positive status is absolutely of highest command, and we highly appreciate what you're doing. Second quick point, Dominic George, the Reverend from Nigeria, that I don't recall the name, like what you were bringing to this discussion is absolutely crucial for the start of the discussion at country level. Please do register your observations. Please do remember when these processes will start in the country that you are among us, among other participants of this discussion, to make sure that from the very start, the platform, the framework for dialogue is in proper hands and is addressing the critical issues for all of us. The third and final point is to say that we definitely see a lot of linkages and synergies. We definitely will have to continue our dialogue at the higher level with GNP Plus and other partners around the global coalition, with Global Fund, especially implementing partners for the Global Fund and portfolio managers for the 3 countries, with Office of the High Commissioner, Ibrahim, your team, and other colleagues involved, and probably many other partners. As many said, the work starts after this meeting, and we are committed and convinced we will deliver. Big thank you, dear friends and colleagues. Stay safe, and let's talk soon about our next joint steps in this absolutely crucial path towards the world free of stigma and discrimination, starting with related to HIV, finishing free completely. Thank you very much. Final word to Francesca.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to say to all of you, a happy Human Rights Day, and thanks to all the human rights defenders and promoters among the group. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to collaborating with each of you for the implementation of the dialogue and stigma discrimination reduction intervention. Thank you.